Welcome to the ISO Show, dispelling myths and sharing tips for success to improve your business with ISO standards, with your host, Mel Blackmore.
Hello and welcome to the ISO Show. Today we're going to be exploring one of the most popular standards that we've seen in recent years, ISO 27001, which is the Information Security Standard. So over the years, the most popular standard has been ISO 9001, which we did a podcast series on how to implement a few weeks ago. But what we found over the years is that it used to be environmental standards that were the second most popular, and then health and safety standards, and then information security after that, so that was kind of fourth in the pecking order. But actually, over the last few years, with recent security breaches and all sorts of, more awareness around the data breaches, and obviously we've heard about Facebook breaches and Google and other big profile organisations, that there's a heightened awareness of the value of our data and the risks that we're exposed to, both as individuals and of course companies. So I thought it'd be really useful to take you through how to implement ISO 27001, which is now the second most popular standard that we implement here at Blackmores, and I believe it's the second most popular standard that the certification bodies are assessing against as well. So I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by one of our consultants, Steve Mason, who's a senior information security consultant here at Blackmores, but he brings with him a wealth of experience, and not only from consultancy, but also assessing the standard and also working in environments and implementing standards long before he was an assessor as well for a certification body. So what we're going to be doing is, over the course of the next 3 episodes, is taking you through step by step how to implement an information security management system compliant to the standard. So hopefully we'll be able to demystify some of those things around the standard, and hopefully just to make it a little bit more easy to understand and practical for you to be able to implement information security controls. Whether you want to go for certification or not, hopefully the next few episodes will provide you with a few tools and tips for improving information security within your organisation. And I'd just like to stress that it's not just about IT security. Some of the things that we'll be talking about will cover physical security, which can include access to your building, to your premises. Also, security around your employees. So looking at screening and vetting, as well as when somebody leaves your company. How do you still keep your data secure? And of course, the IT security part of it as well, which we'll be covering. Okay, so without further ado, hello Steve.
Hello Mel, hi, nice to see you.
Thanks very much for sharing your knowledge with us over the coming episodes.
Pleasure.
And so, before we begin, could you share with us something that not many people know about you?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I've probably got quite a few things, but I guess the one that people probably don't know so much about is that I'm a church minister in my spare time. So I'm not ordained or anything like that, but I'm what's known as a reader in the Church of England. So that simply is somebody who is able to preach and lead worship in the Church of England, or do some teaching if that's required. And it's a position that goes back as far as Elizabeth I. And she brought the role in because there were not many priests around at the time, and it was said that they needed people that were of a sound mind, good learning and sober disposition. I don't know whether I fit into all 3 of those, but
I'm sure you do, and I'm sure it helps you in your profession as an ISO consultant as well.
Yeah, so but it's one of those things that it got stopped by Oliver Cromwell, but then got started again by Queen Victoria, and has been going strong ever since. And it's a role that we're finding as lay people is expanding in what we can and can't do in the church.
Right, okay.
So they rely on us quite a lot. So
could you give us an example of what you can do and what you can't do?
Well, I can preach, I can lead services. I'm beginning to do a lot more of communion by extension. So that simply means that the parish priest will bless the communion, and then I will take a service elsewhere, and that will lead the service and distribute the communion at that point. I can't baptise anybody or do weddings or anything like that, but I can bury people.
Oh.
As long as they're dead.
Okay. Handy. Right, moving on. So let's start with. So we've got a copy of the standard. Let's start there.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's hope our ISO show listeners have got a copy of the standard.
Yep.
They've looked at it, and then they're probably scratching their heads, thinking, "Okay,
Where
do we begin?"
Yes, yeah.
So where do we begin, Steve?
I think the first thing is to understand the structure of the standard, because without understanding that, it can be a bit of a minefield. We've got the structure of clauses and controls. So at the beginning, we've got clauses 1 to 10, and then we've got the controls that follow. Now, the clauses 1 to 10 are really about putting your management system in place. Now, clauses 1, 2 and 3 are never audited by an external body. Those are meant to be guidance notes on how to implement the standard or what the standard's about. So we really start from clause 4 and work all the way through to clause 10. That then creates the structure, the framework around which you're going to build your management system. And when you're building your management system, there's a section in clause 6 where you have to look at risks and identify the controls you're going to implement. That's when you turn to the controls at the back, and they're from A5 through to A18. Don't ask me why it starts at A5, I haven't got a clue. I don't think even the standards people do.
So it starts at number 4, and
number
also
at the back
it's
4 to
A5.
10, and then 5 to 18. Yeah.
Right,
So,
okay.
so don't worry about anything like A4, A1, A2. They just don't exist. But those controls are actually developed around different parts of the business. So there'd be something around general policies and general good security in the business. Then we've got HR, we've got access control, asset management, right the way through to operations of IT, and even through to suppliers. You mentioned the different sort of security things we should be aware of. And your supply chain is one of those security areas that people so often overlook and can actually cause you a lot of problems.
Okay, lovely. So it covers the whole shebang then.
Yeah, that's right.
So that's a great overview of the standard itself then. Lovely. So what do we do with it then?
Right, well, the first thing we really must do is understand what we have already in place. So we can do a gap analysis. So a good gap analysis would include all the requirements of the clauses and all the requirements of the controls, and you work through it step by step and honestly answer those questions, saying, have we got this? If we have, how much of it have we got? Or how little of it have we got? And if we haven't got it, just be honest, we haven't got it. That way you understand where you're starting from. It could be that with a gap analysis you find that you've got 80% of it in place. So that's a good starting point to work from. Other cases you might find you've got nothing in place. Well, at least we know where we're starting from.
So typically, what are the kinds of things that businesses already have in place, and which are the things that you typically find that are missing?
Right, often the things that they have in place are some of the things around IT. So you might find they have an asset register in place, but it may not be a perfect asset register. So at least we know we've got something that we can build upon to develop. But you'll also find that they've definitely got antivirus in place, because I can't think of any organisation that wouldn't have antivirus in place. And they would have firewalls in place. They'll be doing backups of their data, all that sort of thing. So you find they're already in place. But again, it might just need a bit of a tweak to tidy up. What you find is missing is often the sort of policies and procedures.
Right, okay. So you're saying then, clearly they've got antivirus,
Yes.
but they might not necessarily have a controlled way of dealing with that across the
Exactly,
business?
exactly. Yeah, it might be a bit flaky, a bit hit and miss.
And so if it was like a data backup, so most obviously you'd expect businesses to back up data.
Yes, yeah.
But they might not necessarily have a documented procedure that says what they have to back up, when it's going to be backed up, who's responsible, when is it done. So
Exactly,
is that the kind of thing that
that's precisely
looking
it.
for?
Yeah. So also with a backup policy, I often find that they know when they're going to back up and what they're going to back up. But if things go wrong, they don't always follow through as to why it's gone wrong. They don't keep good records of why backups have failed. Has it failed because of somebody leaving a part of their system open somewhere, so they can't back up that file? Has it failed because the backup area they're going to isn't working correctly? That sort of thing, So.
Interesting. So businesses could be constantly just firefighting and having these issues. They back up the data, but not necessarily the way it should be.
Exactly,
But they just deal with it in terms of, it's just a firefighting situation.
Yes,
but they don't necessarily take a step back
Yes.
to look at how that could be prevented
Exactly.
in the future.
In fact, one of the worst situations I came across of backup was where one organisation had a third party supposed to be doing backup, but because they didn't have a policy in place as to who would be doing what backups, because the company was doing their own as well, there was a number of files that weren't being backed up. And it turned out these files were the critical files of the business.
Right.
And when I arrived in the business to do an assessment, I realised there were 6 months of critical files that had never been backed up.
So this is why it's important to identify what you're backing up,
Exactly,
not just the
yes.
process for doing it. It's what's critical to the business
Yes.
and how is it done then? Because obviously, if you lose that person that's doing the backup, that's responsible for it, you've potentially lost that
Skill, yes.
Yes,
Yeah, exactly,
yeah,
yes.
yeah.
I think that goes in with all standards, make sure the knowledge and the skill is either within the system or is within a policy or procedure, so they can easily take over these things without any issues.
Brilliant. Okay. So that's provided a really good overview of typically what's included within a business, covering information security. Because I think a lot of businesses will think, well, we don't do any of this.
Yes,
when
yeah.
actually they are already doing a lot of it without even realising it.
And that's what the gap analysis does. It makes people think about what they do and what they don't do. And by asking the right questions based around the standard, you can tease those thoughts out of people's minds. And it might be that there's a manager somewhere saying, oh, we don't do that. And yet there's an operator somewhere that's saying, actually, we do that. And this is what we've got. So it does help to bring everybody's thoughts to the table and iron out where you've got to start building your system.
Great. So you mentioned about people then. So typically, who would be involved with that gap analysis and how long would it take of their time and your time?
It could typically take up to about a day to do a gap analysis, because you've got to work through all those clauses and all those controls. So it really depends on what sort of support you get from the organisation. And what I mean by support is, have you got the right people in the room? So we need to think up front as to who we need available in that meeting. Typically an operations manager or director would be very good in there, because they would hopefully have that overview of the organisation and who does what. I would then expect to have a large representation from IT, because although this is not meant to be an IT-only standard, it does have quite a lot of IT input into it. I'd also expect a representative from HR and have somebody available from purchasing for the supplier side. Anybody that's involved in business continuity should be available there, or perhaps heading up the business continuity. And finally, somebody that's involved in the legal side, compliance within the organisation, because there is a legal aspect to 27001.
Okay, so in terms of the legal aspect, I mean, typically how many legislative acts are there for a business? I know that's probably how long is a piece of string.
Yeah, well, there was one organisation that worked out there's about 69 to 70 laws that impact information security.
Is that in the UK?
That's in the UK only, yeah. And to be quite honest, if you dig into all 69, 70 of those laws, a lot of them are about a single line within a bit of legislation that just happens to mention information security or looking after information. So what we try and do, certainly from a Blackmores point of view, is narrow it down to a sort of a group of about 15 or 20 laws that are around that you're most likely to come across within your day-to-day business.
And obviously GDPR is one of those,
GDPR is certainly one
which
of them,
has been
yes.
Very topical in,
yes, very
in
much
recent
so,
times.
Yeah. And there are other ones like the Electronic Communications Act, and there's RIPA, there's the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, there's Computer Misuse Act. So there's lots of little ones creeping in here.
I think that might be another podcast in the
that
making,
will
Steve.
be, yeah. I think I won't go into all those.
Okay, no, I think we'll definitely come back to that on another episode. I think that would be really interesting to find out more about that, actually.
Good, excellent.
Yeah, okay, great. So it's a good cross-representation of the organisation that provides input to that gap analysis process to really dig down under the skin of how you receive data, how you handle data.
Yes.
How it's communicated, disposed of, etc. So that's really interesting.
And I think it's also a time within the gap analysis to do that, a little bit of education about the standard and tell people what's expected. Because sometimes you enter into these things and you've got preconceived ideas that it's going to be impossible to do this. But actually when you get talking with people, you talk to perhaps people in HR or the supplier maintenance, procurement, that sort of thing, you can actually say to people, well, this is really what the standard's after. Although it says all this, we can
so
narrow
it's
it
really
down to
about
something.
interpreting what it really means for that business. Yeah.
Narrow it down to something simple. And I've always said security is not a straitjacket. If you turn security into a straitjacket, you've failed. It's got to be that comfortable overcoat. The other thing is you're not trying to build Fort Knox. So make sure you've got a secure business, but not Fort Knox.
Yeah, I remember a number of years ago now, there's one particular aspect of the standard. This was when I was fairly new to the standard, which was clock synchronisation. And I was thinking, what on earth is clock synchronisation in a security standard for? And I was scratching my head trying to think, well, how are we going to demonstrate this? And the assessor clearly demonstrated it because they wanted to see the CCTV footage from when they walked in the door that morning. So we went down to the area where the CCTV cameras were, and we looked at the time when I arrived, because it was evident in the visitor's book when I signed in, that's the time. Yet I was not visible on the CCTV footage. And the question was asked, why was that? And I said, well, I definitely came in, that's the time that I signed in. And the reason for looking at clock synchronisation is going back and looking at evidence as well, isn't it?
It's very much so, yes.
All sorts of different things in terms of backup, when you're doing your backup. But in that particular case, the clocks hadn't gone forward. The clocks had changed in the UK, but the CCTV wasn't on the main server network.
Right.
So it wasn't aligned to the correct time.
Yeah.
So it actually saw me coming in at a different hour.
Yes, yeah. And that's the most common failure, actually. Wherever I go, you find that go to CCTV, you find it's out by an hour. So the worst I've seen is been out by 13 hours for some weird reason. I think it's because somebody forgot it was a 24-hour clock. But the other thing about synchronisation for the clocks is that if you've got applications and systems that have automatic timings on them that will switch the system on perhaps for your backups and things like that, the clock has got to be accurate. Because if the clock's supposed to be turning on at 5 o'clock to start doing the backups, you don't want it turning on at 4 o'clock whilst people are still in the office.
Yeah. But I mean, on a serious note, with the CCTV, if there was an incident where there was a break-in at a particular time, there'd be no evidence to show the police because obviously it looks as though that didn't actually happen at that time.
Exactly, yes, yeah.
So, yes, I think the gap analysis then doesn't just serve to identify the gaps and where the weaknesses are.
It could be educational.
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah.
Fantastic. So I think we've just got time to look at the next stage, which I think is the risk assessment, isn't it, Steve?
Yes, it can be the next stage. Although I would, before I do the risk assessment, literally understand what the scope and context is of the organisation.
Good
we
point.
mustn't forget
yes,
that.
very good point.
Because we could go off with a bit of a scattergun approach doing our risk assessment and start risk assessing bits of the business that aren't actually in scope.
So could you just explain a little bit about scope then and what a business needs to take into consideration?
Yeah. Okay, when we're looking at the scope of an organisation, we want to understand, are we going to have the whole of our business under the certification or under the information security management system, or is it only going to be part of the business? Now, some people turn around and say, oh, we'll just have IT under the information security system. That's fine, but it's got lots of weaknesses to it, but that's another podcast, I think. But they then elect to just follow that, so we'll then do the gap analysis around IT. But others turn around and say, no, we'll do the whole of the business, although we won't do that bit over there because they're actually not part of our business. They just happen to be working within our business to support us. So they might actually come into your risk assessment somewhere along the line, but they're not actually part of the scope.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much for explaining that, because I think some businesses think that you have to implement it for the entire business, but that's not necessarily the case,
is choice, that's right. You know, it's really what your client needs. I've been to some organisations that have just simply said, we will do our information security around one particular client, and other clients outside just don't come under that system.
Rightly or wrongly, it could be budget restraints or it's just a timing. It could be, okay, we'll do this client initially, roll it out, and then we can expand it.
Exactly.
Okay. So the next stage then after the scoping is...
once you know what your scope is, you can then start to do your risk assessment. Because within your scope, you're going to have information. And information could be in written form, it can be in spoken form, it could be perhaps on a computer, electronic-wise. You've got to understand what information you hold. When I say spoken form, don't forget all those voice-recorded telephone conversations you have, especially if you're in a call centre. You're going to have all that information around. How are you protecting that information from actually getting out? In some cases, you have to hold on to that information for a year. In one case I'm working with at the moment, it's 27 years they have to hold that information for, but that's another story. So once you know what your information is, you then have to say, well, who is the owner of that information? In other words, which department is responsible for that information? So you've got your information, you've got the department, then you have to work out what sort of medium is it in. Is it in hard copy, soft copy, or is it spoken form, tape, that sort of thing. Once you've got that, you can then start to do your risk assessment. Now, risk assessments can either be very, very complicated or very easy. It depends how you start doing it. We've chosen, certainly in Blackmores, to take a slightly easier approach, but it's not that we cut corners. It's that we've gone back to ISO 27005, which is the risk assessment standard for 27001, and we've chosen to group our risks into 6 main categories. And through those 6 main categories, we can actually risk assess all the information we have. So when you risk assess information, you start by saying, well, how confidential is this information, and give it a score. How important is this information to be accurate, and give it a score. And how important is it to make sure this information is always made available? You can then give it a score. Then look at the risks and the threats to that information, those 6 categories, and you ask yourself the simple thing, what's the likelihood of this information being stolen? What's the likelihood of systems going down, and so on and so forth? Once you've got the score for the likelihood, you can then say, well, what's the impact? The likelihood might be low, but actually the impact is high.
I guess especially if the asset value is significantly
Very
valuable
much so,
to the
yes.
business.
Yeah. So if you take personal data, since the advent of GDPR, personal data has actually gone up,
significantly.
Absolutely. So your confidentiality is a 10, your integrity is a 10, your availability could be anything between 5, 7 or 10, depending on what's in that information. You then come to the likelihood of any of that being stolen or corrupted. The likelihood might be low because you've got good systems in place, but the impact is always going to be high. It's always going to be a 10 because there are the legal repercussions if you get it wrong. But that's not the end of the story, because that will give you a result. But you then got to say, well, okay, what have we already got in place to actually protect that information?
So the existing controls that the business has.
Exactly. And they might turn around and say, well, we've got really good controls. Well, I tend to say, well, let's not score it a high score, because we want to actually go and test those controls. So let's bring it down a little bit. So I tend to give it a score of a 7, which simply means we've got a control, we think it's good, we just need to go and audit it.
So that could be encrypting data, for example.
Yes, yeah. It could be that once we go and audit it, we can then turn it up to a 10.
Because it's proven that it's an effective
Exactly.
control.
That will then give you that overall score that you need as to what your risks are.
Yeah. So do you cover off all sorts of different things like, intentional risks, like hacking, and do you cover those things, and also the accidental?
Yeah, that would all be in there.
Risks as well, like accidentally leaving a laptop or accidentally sending an email with data to the wrong person.
Yes, that would all be in there, because within those groups of 6 threats, you would actually have a list of what they all represent. Okay. And some of those might include things like sending information to the wrong people, or having hackers in from outside, even down to the environmental threats of your office gets struck by lightning, or the reception area has just been flooded because you're on a floodplain.
Of course, you mentioned about business continuity as well, so that all ties in with that.
Yeah,
then.
Very much so, yeah. So you're not just purely looking at the bit of paper that's in your hand or the system that you're working on, you're looking at the whole environment.
Interesting. So what's the output of that then?
The output of that is that we will hopefully get a set of scores around the risks, and where we've got a score at the moment, I tend to work on a score of 50. So where we've got a score of 50 and above, we have to do what's known as risk treatment. And that simply is to look at what the risk is, assess that risk, and then go away and determine what it is we need to do to put that risk right, to mitigate the risk. Now, sometimes we can't put risks right, and this is a misunderstanding that people have, that when you do a risk assessment, they think, you've got to put it all right. But no, it doesn't work like that. Risk assessment is about either mitigating it, you can insure against it, or if it's going to be too costly to put right, you get management to accept it. So you don't have to always put these things right. Once you've actually decided what you're going to do, you can then either turn that into an action, immediate action that you can go and do, or you might turn it into an objective with a small program of activities associated with that objective.
Okay, great. Well, talking about activities, that's what we're going to be discussing in the next episode, aren't we? So we're going to be talking about taking the information from your gap analysis and your risk assessment and put those into action. And as you mentioned, it could be objectives, it could be policies, it could be procedures, but whatever it is, that's then going to create your information security management system.
Exactly, yes.
Excellent. Well, I really look forward to catching up with you on that next episode, Steve.
Brilliant, so do I. Yeah, I'm with you.
Well, thanks very much for